Your father has already spoken for you." Martha Reed heard the words at the supper table, with her fork still in her hand and the last gold of the evening lying across the cabin floor. Outside, the valley was settling toward winter. Inside, her father would not meet her eyes. Frank Ward had agreed to take her as his wife before the first snow, he said, as if he were speaking of firewood, flour, or the fixing of a roof before bad weather came. Martha set her fork down carefully. The sound was small, but it made the room feel smaller. She looked at the empty chair across from her, at the worn table her own hands had scrubbed clean that morning, at the stove she had fed since daylight. Everything in that cabin had work attached to it. Everything except the choice being taken from her. She did not raise her voice. She had learned long ago that some losses did not answer to noise. Her mother had died when Martha was 14, and since then Martha had carried water, baked bread, mended shirts, planted beans, and kept moving through the kind of days that did not ask whether a girl was tired. Her father said Frank was capable. He knew the mountains. He had a roof, a stove, and enough stores to last through hard snow. Martha looked at him then. Useful was not the same as good. Her father's hands tightened around his cup. He had no answer that could change what he had done. After supper, Martha walked to the river and stood there until the cold worked through her sleeves. The water moved black and fast between the stones. Across the clearing, Frank Ward's cabin sat near the timberline with one yellow square of light in its window. She had seen him at communal work, silent at the edge of things, lifting beams, setting posts, leaving when the job was done. Men called him steady. Women called him hard to know. Children did not run from him, but they did not crowd him either. Martha watched smoke rise from his chimney and tried to imagine waking under that roof. A stranger's roof, a stranger's table, a stranger's name. By morning, frost had silvered the grass. She packed one trunk, one wool blanket, and the small tin box that had belonged to her mother. She did not cry while folding her dresses. She did not cry when her father carried the trunk across the clearing. Frank opened the door before they knocked, his face calm, his shirt sleeves rolled, the fire already going behind him. Martha stepped inside and saw a narrow room off the main cabin, its door standing open. Frank set her trunk beside it, then moved his own bedroll from the corner and laid it near the stove. He did not touch her things. He did not smile like a man pleased with what had been arranged. He only looked once at the room, then at her. "That door closes from the inside," he said. "No one opens it but you." Frank left before first light. Martha heard the door open, then close softly enough that the latch barely clicked. She lay still in the narrow bed, watching the gray morning gather along the window glass, listening for the kind of return that might prove she had misunderstood him. None came. When she finally stepped into the main room, the stove was already warm, coffee sat on the back of it, and a pan of cornmeal mush had been left near the coals with a clean cloth over it. One bowl waited on the table. One spoon. No command. No note. Just enough food kept warm without asking anything in return. Martha stood beside the chair for a long moment before she sat. The cabin looked different in daylight. Plain walls. Pegs by the door. A rifle hung high and out of the way. Traps were stacked in careful order beside a workbench, each one cleaned, oiled, and set where a hand could find it in the dark. There was no softness in the room, but there was no neglect either. A man could live hard and still keep things decent. She washed the bowl, swept the floor, and shook the ashes down from the stove because work was easier than wondering. By noon, Hannah Whitaker came across the clearing with a jar of apple preserves and a face too bright to be casual. She looked at the bedroll near the stove. She looked at the closed door to Martha's room. She said little after that. When Frank returned at dusk, he carried 2 rabbits and a sack of potatoes from old Mr. Harlan, who owed him for a repaired wagon tongue. He set both on the table, stepped back, and waited as if the kitchen belonged to Martha only if she chose to use it. She took the potatoes first. He nodded once and went outside to wash at the pump. Supper was quiet. Not cold, just quiet. Frank ate what she made without correction, cleared his own plate, and left the better half of the rabbit for the next day without mentioning it. That night, Martha closed her bedroom door and slid the latch into place. It turned smooth under her fingers. Across the room, Frank settled near the stove. The fire breathed low between them, and for the first time since her father spoke her future aloud, the quiet did not feel like a threat. By the third morning, Martha knew the sounds of the cabin before daylight. The stove settling, the wind moving against the east wall, Frank folding his bedroll with the same quiet care he gave to everything he touched. He did not speak unless there was a reason. He did not watch her unless she had already spoken. He made the room feel less like a claim and more like a place she had been allowed to stand in without being crowded. That made it harder to know what to do with him. After breakfast, she found him outside by the chopping block, trimming a split in the handle of the axe. The handle had been rough the day before. She had noticed it only because her palm had caught on it while carrying wood. She had said nothing. Frank turned the wood slowly, shaved the bad edge clean, and rubbed it smooth with a scrap of leather. When he saw her standing there, he held the axe-out handle first, not like a gift, not like a favor, just like a tool made safer for the person using it. Martha took it. Her fingers closed over the smooth place. There was no splinter now. She looked down at her hand, then back at him. He had already turned toward the shed. Work came first. Questions could wait. That afternoon, she scrubbed the shelf above the stove, sorted the flour sack away from the damp wall, and found a crack under the window where cold air slid in thin as a knife. Before sundown, Frank came in with a strip of oiled cloth and a small wooden wedge. He fixed the crack without being asked. Then he set a folded blanket at the foot of her bed and went to wash his hands. Martha stood in the doorway of her room, looking at the blanket. It was plain brown wool, mended twice at one edge. Not new, not fine, warm. That night, the wind rose hard from the north. The cabin creaked, but the window no longer rattled. The latch on her door held firm. Near the stove, Frank slept with one arm folded under his head and his boots placed ready beside him. Martha lay awake longer than she meant to, listening to the fire and the storm. By morning, she had stopped wondering whether he had noticed her discomfort. She began wondering how much else he had noticed and kept to himself. The fourth day brought a thaw, just enough to soften the yard into dark mud and make every chore heavier. Martha carried 2 buckets from the pump before breakfast, careful with her hem, careful with her footing, careful not to look toward Frank when he stepped out of the shed and took in the way the handle cut into her fingers. He did not offer to take the buckets. She would have refused if he had. Instead, when she came back for a third trip, she found a yoke hanging from the pump post, freshly shaved at the shoulder curve and wrapped with a strip of old flannel where the wood would rest against her neck. She stood there with one hand on the pump handle. Then she set the buckets on the hooks and carried twice the water with half the strain. Frank was at the woodpile, splitting kindling like he had not done a thing worth mentioning. Later, Mrs. Whitaker sent her oldest girl with a crock of starter and a request for bread if Martha had the strength for baking. The child lingered on the porch, peering around Martha's skirt toward the cabin, curious about the new wife and the man who never came to visiting suppers unless something needed repairing. Martha gave her a heel of yesterday's cornbread wrapped in cloth. The girl smiled with crumbs already on her fingers. Frank came up from the shed in time to see it, paused once, then turned away and stacked another armload of wood beside the door. That evening, Martha made stew from rabbit, potatoes, and the last of the onions. She set one bowl at Frank's place and one across from it before she thought better of the habit. Across, not apart. Frank washed at the basin, dried his hands, and stopped when he saw the table. Only a breath. Then he sat where the bowl waited. They ate with the fire popping low and the room smelling of broth and wool drying by the stove. When he finished, he took both bowls to the wash basin and left the larger piece of bread on the plate between them. Not his side. Not hers. Between. Martha reached for it after a moment and broke it clean in two. Frank took the smaller half without looking up. The next morning, the girl from the Whitaker place came back with 2 little brothers behind her and an empty cloth in her hands. Martha had 3 loaves cooling by the window. She sent one home with them. By dusk, word had moved quietly across the settlement. Frank's cabin had bread in it now. Warm bread. A woman's hand on the place. Martha heard the children laughing down the road and looked at the supper table, at the crumbs near Frank's plate, at the door to her room still open behind her. She closed it only when she went to bed, and even then, she did not slide the latch. By the end of the first week, the cabin had begun to answer Martha's hands. The flour stayed dry because she had moved it to the upper shelf. The draft near the stove no longer slipped under the wall because Frank had sealed it after seeing her tuck her skirt around her ankles at supper. The bread crock was full more often than empty. The water yoke hung by the pump as if it had always belonged there. None of it looked like tenderness from a distance. It looked like work. That was why Martha trusted it a little more. On Monday, she found Frank's heavy shirt torn along the shoulder seam, folded at the end of the bench instead of thrown aside. He had not asked her to mend it. He had simply put it where mending could be found if mending wished to find it. She took it after breakfast and worked the needle through the cloth while the stew simmered. His shirts were worn thin at the cuffs, patched cleanly but without care for looks. A man who kept useful things until they could give no more. When he came in that evening and saw the shirt folded beside his plate, the mended seam facing down, he stopped only long enough to notice the stitch. Then he washed, sat, and ate. The next morning, the shirt was gone from the bench and on his back. That was all. It was enough. The Whitaker children came twice that week, first for bread, then for a strip of cloth to tie a doll's arm back on. Martha fixed the doll at the table while the smallest boy stood near the stove warming his hands. Frank came in with snow on his shoulders and paused at the sight of 3 children in his cabin. The smallest boy froze. Frank took one look at his wet boots, stepped back outside, and returned with a split log that he set near the fire as a little seat. The boy sat on it without being told. Martha kept her eyes on the doll so no one would have to speak over the moment. On Thursday, Mr. Harlan's old mare slipped her halter near the timberline, and Frank brought her back after dark with ice crusted along his coat. Martha had coffee waiting and a bowl kept warm under a tin plate. He stood by the stove, thawing slowly, and looked at the bowl as though he had not expected to be considered after the work was done. She had not expected that look to matter. It did. He ate standing for the first few bites, then sat across from her when she pushed the chair out with her foot. Outside, the wind moved hard across the clearing. Inside, the table held 2 bowls, a heel of bread, and the quiet shape of something neither of them named. On Saturday, Martha swept the porch and found Frank adding a second peg beside the door, lower than his own, smooth and newly cut. Her shawl hung there by evening. Not over a chair. Not on the trunk in her room. By the door. The place where things stayed when a person meant to come back. That night, she left her bedroom door open while she braided her hair by the fire. Frank looked once from the workbench, then lowered his eyes to the leather strap in his hands. He did not smile. He did not speak. But before he went to sleep beside the stove, he turned the lamp down low instead of blowing it out, leaving the room in a soft amber glow, enough light for her to find her way if she rose in the dark. Martha sat with the braid unfinished in her lap, watching the flame steady itself. The cabin was still small. The marriage was still arranged. But for the first time, the room did not feel borrowed. The first hard snow came on a Tuesday and turned the clearing quiet before noon. It covered the woodpile, softened the wagon ruts, and pressed white against the cabin window until the whole world seemed to have pulled back from the door. Frank left early to check the lower traps and the Harlan fence line, and Martha spent the morning with sleeves rolled, working flour into dough while the stove breathed steady heat against her side. By midday, the Whitaker children appeared through the snow, bundled in uneven scarves, carrying a pail of milk their mother had sent before the weather turned worse. The youngest had red hands and a chin trying not to tremble. Martha brought them inside without fuss, set their mittens near the stove, and poured warm water into a basin so their fingers could thaw slowly. She gave them bread with apple preserves and made them sit on the split log Frank had brought in days before. When Frank returned, his coat was stiff with snow and his beard silvered white. He stopped in the doorway at the sight of the children, then looked at the wet mittens, the pail by the table, the smallest boy asleep against the wood box. He did not ask why they were there. He stepped back outside, shook the snow from his coat, and came in quieter than before. Martha saw him take the axe from its peg and split 2 thin pieces of kindling small enough for a child to manage. He set them beside the boy's boots. Later, when the snow eased, Frank walked the children halfway home, carrying the youngest on one arm and the milk pail in the other. Martha watched from the porch until the white swallowed them. She found herself standing with one hand on the lower peg where her shawl hung. The cabin felt different without them. Not emptier, wider, as if the walls had learned they could hold more than 2 careful people. That evening, Frank came back with a twist of blue ribbon in his gloved hand. The Whitaker girl had dropped it in the snow. He laid it on the table beside Martha's sewing basket. Martha dried it near the stove, then tied it around the handle of the basket so it would not be lost again before morning. Frank noticed. He noticed everything. He sat at the workbench after supper, shaping a small wooden horse from a scrap of pine. No hurry, no flourish. His hands moved with the same patience he gave a broken latch or a frightened child. Martha mended by the fire and watched the shavings curl onto the floor. The next day, the children came for the ribbon and left with the horse. The youngest held it against his chest like something rare. Frank went back to his work before anyone could thank him too warmly. But Martha saw his ears redden when the little boy waved from the road. That night, she set 3 biscuits aside under a cloth, then added a 4th without thinking. Frank saw the extra place on the plate and said nothing. He only brought in more wood than the evening needed and stacked it close to the stove, enough for morning, enough for guests, enough for a house that had begun, quietly, to expect someone might come in cold and be fed. On the 9th morning, Martha found the paper tucked beneath her father's tin coffee cup, folded once, with her name written in his careful hand. Frank had ridden out before sunup, and the cabin was quiet except for the stove and the small sounds of thaw dripping from the eaves. She opened it at the table. Her father had spoken with the preacher at Fort Kessler, 12 miles south. The arrangement could still be set aside before winter closed the road for good. A wagon would come on Friday. Martha read the lines twice, then laid the paper beside the bread crock. Her first feeling was not joy. That was what stopped her. She went through the morning chores with the letter watching from the table. She strained milk, swept ash, folded the blanket at the foot of her bed, and carried water with the yoke Frank had carved to fit her shoulders. Every object answered with the weight of use. The smooth axe handle, the lower peg by the door, the split log near the stove, the ribbon tied to her sewing basket. None of them asked her to stay. They only reminded her that staying had become something with shape. Frank came back near dusk with flour from the Whitakers and a loose wool rim he had promised to mend for Mr. Harlan. He saw the paper before he took off his coat. His hand slowed once. Then he hung his hat, washed at the basin, and set the flour on the shelf Martha had cleared. He did not ask. That night, he ate quietly, then went to the workbench and began fitting iron to wood by lamplight so Harlan's wagon could roll before the next freeze. Martha sat by the fire with her mending untouched in her lap. The letter stayed between them on the table. In the morning, Frank had the wagon ready. Not Harlan's. His own. He had packed oats, a wool blanket, dried apples, 2 jars of preserves, and a sack of biscuits wrapped in Martha's cloth. The road south would be cold. He had thought of that. He had thought of everything except asking her not to go. Martha stood in the doorway of her room, looking at the trunk she had not packed. Then the Whitaker children appeared at the porch, cheeks red from the cold, the wooden horse in the youngest boy's hand. Their mother's bread pan had cracked, and they had come to ask whether Martha could lend one until town opened again. The little girl saw the wagon, then the trunk still empty, then Martha's face. She held the cracked pan with both hands and said nothing. Martha took the pan from her. She went to the shelf, lifted her best tin pan, and placed it in the child's arms. Then she turned back into the cabin, took her shawl from the lower peg, and hung it there again instead of putting it on. Frank watched from beside the wagon. Martha crossed to the table, picked up her father's letter, and folded it small. She slid it into the sewing basket beneath the blue ribbon. After that, she rolled up her sleeves, took down the flour, and began measuring for bread. By late afternoon, the whole settlement knew Martha had not taken the wagon south. No one said it plainly at first. They came for flour, for a borrowed pan, for a hinge Frank had promised to set, and each pair of eyes found the trunk still in her room, the shawl on the lower peg, the bread cooling by the window. Martha kept her hands busy. She kneaded, swept, poured coffee, and let the work answer what her mouth did not need to. Near sundown, her father crossed the clearing with his hat in both hands. Frank was at the chopping block, splitting kindling for the night. He saw Walter Reed coming and set the axe down, but he did not step between them. Not yet. Martha met her father on the porch. The cold had brought color to his face and worry to his shoulders. He looked past her once, into the cabin, at the table set for 2 and the extra biscuits under cloth for any child who might come hungry. Then he looked at the wagon still packed near the shed. Martha waited. Her father took out the preacher's paper, unfolded it, and held it toward her. She did not take it. The silence stretched. Frank moved then, not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to leave her alone in it. He came to the porch with a split log under one arm and set it beside the door, where the children sat when they visited. Then he took the lower peg from the wall, the one he had carved for Martha's shawl, tightened the loose screw with his pocket knife, and hung her shawl back in its place. Plain work. Public work. A man putting her place back where it belonged while her father watched. Martha's father looked at the peg, then at Frank's bedroll still folded near the stove, and something in his face changed slowly. He had arranged a marriage for safety. He had not expected to find respect already living inside it. Frank stepped back, giving Martha the porch, the choice, the answer. Martha reached into her sewing basket and brought out the folded letter beneath the blue ribbon. She placed it in her father's hand, then turned to the stove before the bread could darken. Frank followed without speaking. Her father stood outside a long moment, holding the paper that no longer decided anything. When he finally left, Martha set 3 bowls on the supper table instead of 2, in case he came back hungry before dark. Snow came again before dawn, soft enough to quiet the roofs, but not deep enough to stop the children. By mid-morning, the Whitaker girl was at the door with her brothers behind her, carrying Martha's tin pan wrapped in a flour sack. Their mother had sent dried apples in thanks. Martha took the pan and set the apples beside the bread crock, and before she could turn back, Frank had already moved the split log closer to the stove for the smallest boy. No one told him where to sit anymore. He knew. Walter Reed came just before supper, walking slowly through the blue evening cold with his collar turned up and his hat low. Martha saw him from the window and placed another bowl on the table without asking whether he would stay. Frank looked at the third bowl, then brought in an extra piece of wood and set it on the fire. Her father entered with snow on his boots and apology in the careful way he wiped them clean before stepping fully inside. He did not say much. He did not need to. Martha gave him coffee. Frank gave him the chair nearest the stove. Supper was beans, bread, apples warmed in a little butter, and quiet that no longer felt empty. Afterward, the children carried scraps to the old hound outside, and Walter Reed fixed the loose handle on Martha's flour scoop, while Frank sharpened the kitchen knife on a stone. 2 men working under the same roof, without filling the room with pride. Martha washed the bowls and listened to the small sounds of a house holding together. Later, when the lamps were low, Frank took his bedroll from beside the stove. Martha heard the familiar rustle, then the pause. She turned from the shelf and found him standing with it in his hands, looking toward the narrow room as if asking without asking. Martha crossed to the door he had given her on the first day. She touched the latch, smooth from use, then left the door open. Frank laid the bedroll just outside it, not inside. Close enough to belong, far enough to honor the choice. In the morning, Martha hung a second cup beside his, on the shelf, and when sunlight reached the cabin floor, it found her shawl on the lower peg, his coat above it, and fresh bread cooling on the table between them.